This is the Marketing Podcast Network.
Stories influence, teach, and inspire us. But what about the storytellers who create them? Uncorking a Story profiles storytellers to uncover how their background and life experiences influence the stories they create. We learn what motivates them, their path to success, and what fuels them to keep creating. It all starts by asking one simple question: where does your story begin? Welcome to Uncorking a Story. Now here's your host, Mike Carlin.
Hello and welcome to Uncorking a Story. I'm your host, Mike Carlin, and today I'm excited to introduce you to Ed Di Gangi. Ed was adopted at birth in New York City. An only child, he made no effort to explore his heredity until at age 69, a visit to a cemetery where members of his adoptive mother's family were buried stirred his interest. Over the past 3 years, through extensive archival research and DNA testing, Ed has peeled back the layers of his once unknown family. He joins me today on Uncorking a Story to talk about his book, The Gift Best Given, which recounts the search for his family and tells the story of a young woman's courage as she overcame obstacles to achieve her dreams. Welcome to Uncorking a Story, Ed.
Mike, thank you very much for having me here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
I am too. I'm curious about your story. And of course, I'm going to ask, Ed, tell me, where does your story begin?
Well, this particular story really begins in a cemetery in southern New Jersey. And it was the cemetery where the family of my adoptive mother was buried. And we were up there to, unfortunately, inter the remains of my wife's father at a different cemetery nearby. And having few opportunities to get up there, we went by this particular cemetery. And, I was standing over the gravestone of my adoptive mother's mother and father, and thought it would be kind of neat to go back and try to trace their lineage and find out where they came from. I knew they came from Ukraine. I knew they came at the end of the 19th century, but that was really about it. And I came home here to North Carolina shortly afterwards, went to our local library, sat down at their edition of Ancestry.com, started typing. And when I realized how easy it would be to come up with at least a workable feel for their history, I started thinking, okay, I had never explored my adoption. And I knew all my life that I had been adopted, even though my adoptive parents never spoke of it. And my adoption had been privately arranged, and therefore there was paperwork available to me. And I knew where that was. My adoptive parents, after they passed, or when they passed, left that to me. And I really had shown no interest up to then. But I went home, I got that piece of paper, and there was a name on it that I did not recognize. But intuitively, I knew that was my birth mother.
Really? So they actually had her name written on the paper?
It was my adoption decree. And I always talk about it as my adoption papers, kind of like when you go to the ASPCA. And, it had both my parents' names on it. It had their attorney's name, who for some reason I recognized, and this one other signature that I didn't know the name, but again, intuitively I knew who that was.
So walk me through how the emotions you were feeling when you read that name for the first time.
I had actually read that name for the first time years ago. I was probably not even 10 years old. And, I always say, a lot of kids, when the parents are out going, they explore the liquor cabinet or something like that. I went and I started rummaging through my parents' papers, and I found that piece of paper. And, I looked at it and I understood what it meant. And I read it and I folded it up. I put it back where I found it. And my takeaway at that point was, if my parents were not talking about it, then it's probably something I shouldn't be questioning, or they would be talking about it. And, and I carried that with me. And quite honestly, it didn't have a big effect on my life. My birth mother, and again, my book is about my search for her identity, but it also turned into an homage to her strength and her courage in in arranging my adoption, found me the perfect family. And, and I grew up like any, as well as or better than most natural born kids. So I really had no, compelling desire to go and explore.
Yeah. So tell me. Two things I just need to point out. I love stories that begin in cemeteries, and that involve libraries. So when you were doing your genealogical research on your adoptive family, when did the light go off and say, "Hey, I'm going to start doing this for my birth mother as well"?
I don't think it took a half hour. I had those names for my adoptive mother's mother and father. I started plugging things in. I had one piece of paper that my mother had kept with a location, and I never was able to find that location on the map. Or Thai, I assume it's probably where the family came from. But I had that piece. I started putting the puzzle pieces together and said, if it's this easy for them, let's see how easy it is on my biological side.
Yeah.
And it turned out to be that much easier.
Interesting. Why was it that much easier?
Well, I think part of it was, as I said, my adoptive or my biological family came from Ukraine at the end of the 1800s, and record keeping probably was questionable or spotty at best. And sadly, I think were we to go back there right now looking for it, that may be still more greatly compromised. Mm-hmm. I knew just by dint of my age that my birth mother would have been a native-born American, so there would have been better records, and that proved to be true.
Got it. So I know we don't want to give away too much about the book, but I have to ask, what can you share with us about sort of your birth mother's background and her history and all that?
Yeah, it was real interesting. We're coming up to what would have been her 98th birthday a week from today. She was the youngest of 4 children, born to a conservative Polish Catholic family in the New York City area. And interestingly, she grew up 1 block away from where my adoptive parents brought me home when they adopted me. And, we were probably never, at various times, we were probably never more than 10 minutes apart. She had designs from the time she was very, very young to be a professional ice skater, a performer. And in 1942, she was 17 years old. She got on a train in Grand Central Station in New York City and took that train across the United States and up to British Columbia to Vancouver, where she joined an ice skating troupe. And she performed with them up and down the West Coast, eventually found her way back to New York, where a manager found her another gig where she partnered with interestingly, in the midst of World War II, a German national. And they performed in Cincinnati for several months. And she had a very, very extensive career up to the point that she became unexpectedly pregnant in the summer of 1947, pregnant with me, unmarried, and then returned home to New York, and in secret, other than known to her eldest sister and her sister's husband, managed her pregnancy and then managed my adoption.
Yeah, wow. So so she would have been in her early mid-20s by that point?
She was 23 at the time that I was born. So she was a little bit older. My original thought when I found out that I was adopted was it's going to be this, the story of the high school girl who stayed out after the prom and a couple of months later found out she was dealing with a problem. And it was quite different than that. She was a woman who had reached a pretty high level in her field. She had resources at that point. So she was able to come home and, not be sent to Aunt Martha's house and, and hidden from the rest of the family. She hid herself from the rest of the family. And she, as I said, she managed that entire process.
And her parents never found out?
Other than the sister and the brother-in-law, I have no belief that anybody in that family ever knew. I've
Wow.
been, yeah, I've met, well, at this point, three of my first cousins. There are four. And, and that first question I asked them was, what do you know about my adoption? And they all looked kind of puzzled at me and said, we knew nothing. And in our family, if one person knew, everybody would have known.
Right. So that older sister must have been like, she must have taken it like Omerta, like it's
That,
like,
that's precisely it. Interestingly, I found out later from that older sister's son that a few years after, my mother had placed me for adoption, she gifted her sister and her sister's husband with several thousands of dollars to go and purchase their first home.
wow.
And I assume that was out of gratitude for what they had done in supporting her through that process.
Wow. So your mom, I mean, she sounds, pretty amazing. I'm just thinking about it, but thinking about like the time in which she was growing up. You mentioned early 40s. She left home at 17 to go across the country up to Canada to become an ice skater. I can't imagine that landing well in a conservative Polish Catholic household.
Yeah, it was. I think she was. Well, I guess one of the things is when you're the youngest kid, I think by that point, parents have pretty much given up trying to fight the battle. And I have a chapter in the book about that conversation and her father saying, what if this doesn't work out? And, and you're traveling all that distance, and her mother basically, for the first time kind of standing up to him and saying, what if it does work out?
Yeah.
And he conceded, the plans had been made. She had somebody waiting for her at the other end with this ice troupe. And, she was a traveling showgirl at 17.
Wow. No,
And
so was this all based on your I guess it would have been your aunt's recount of the story, or are you
no,
kind of imagining this?
no, there's a great deal of research that I did. And I think the benefit that I had that many people who try to write a story like this do not have is that she was a public figure.
Mm.
So there was a lot of press information that was available to me. She also, prior to the time of her death, wrote out about 50 pages of handwritten notes, which kind of looked back over her life from the time she was a little girl up to the time that she stopped ice skating prior to my birth. And the interesting thing there was she just basically said, I had to go home and take care of mommy. And that's why she stopped. And so she did not say I stopped because I was pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
But she recapped fairly in fair detail where she was and with whom and the why, where, and when during that whole 5-6 year period.
And then now, did she give these documents, the diary of sorts, to somebody in the family? Is that how you came across them? Or?
Yeah, she left them to her son. She ultimately got married 7 years after I was born. And she had two sons in quick succession, 1956 and 1957. And the younger of the two brothers is no longer alive. The older is. And he was in possession of those materials. He was also in possession of, my mother maintained meticulous photograph albums. And they were date ordered and they were all labeled. And so starting in 1942 all the way through the end of her career in 1956 were photographs of all of her touring and all of her travels. And, so I was privileged to have access to all of that material.
Well, what was it like meeting, it sounds like you got to meet one of your half brothers. What was it like meeting him?
It was a challenge. I think it was more of a challenge to him than it was to me. I gave a great deal of thought before I learned that my mother was no longer alive about how I would approach her if she was. And I would have been very, very, very delicate. When I found out she was not, but that I had a half brother, I just started firing off mail. And they'd come back, undeliverable and not known at this address. And finally, I got something into his hands. And, and it explained that he and I had the same mother. We had different fathers. And I talked to him one night by telephone, and his question was, okay, tell me what kind of kin we are. Now it was pretty simply laid out, and I again explained it, and there was a pause, and the conversation just went off in a different direction, and we experienced that 3 or 4 different times, and I think it was just he didn't want to get his head around it. He could not imagine that his mother had 7 years before his birth given birth to an illegitimate child.
Yeah.
And it was not until we went to visit with him in September of 2017 and I put a copy of the adoption decree in his hands that he finally accepted it. He looked at it, and our mother's signature was very, very distinctive. And the minute he looked at it, he knew. And, he sort of gave me the papers back and said, no, you keep them. I said, this is a photocopy. They really have no value other than to me and maybe to you. And, and he put them away, and about a week later, he called me back up and said, well, I showed those papers to somebody, that he had great trust and reliance in. And I said, well, what did he say? He said, well, he asked me if that's Mama's signature. I said, well, what did you say? I told him, yeah, it was Mama's signature. I said, okay, what did he say? And he said, Ted, it looks like you've got yourself a brother.
Wow.
And from that moment on, there's been no question.
So, I'm curious about your motivation to kind of put this all into a book, because it is, certainly a very personal story. So when did it kind of cross your mind, Ed, to write this down?
Yeah, it is an extremely personal story, or it became one as the process went on. As I started to search and started to collect pieces of information, I think my wife was on a local library website and said, so-and-so is doing a memoir writing class. Maybe you should go there and start writing some of this stuff down. So, I said, always listening to my wife, I went to the memoir writing class, and I started and it started out as just a recount of here's what I did, here's what I found. And, and they were kind of cold black and white events. But as I found more and more about her life, then it became more of a process of writing down, her story as opposed to just mine. And that took some time, and it took a lot of exploration, as you would imagine, and I was very fortunate in that there were still people around who knew her or had at least been close enough associated with her to tell me things. And, people were very, very kind. There are lots of coincidences and serendipitous events, and information just came flowing at me. And as I found out more, I just started, okay, now I've got one stack of here's my search, another stack of here's Mom's story. And, so eventually I had, what looked like book 1 and book 2, and eventually went into the hands of an editor who said, I've got a really good suggestion. Let's interleave all this information and let one piece flow into the next. And it does so beautifully, I think.
Yeah, that sounds, it sounds like a beautiful story. And I'm curious, having not really sort of having any interest growing up in finding your birth mother, was this a way for you to kind of get to know her a little bit and also a way of getting to know yourself a little bit more?
I would say yes and yes. It certainly gave me insight into who my birth mother was. As I said before, I assumed she was some unfortunate high school girl, and who had just kind of moved on with life after that. And I found out that she was a woman with a career and a family around her that she had to had to navigate. And it gave me an appreciation for the strength and the focus and, and the attention that she paid to where she found herself. And, again, as I mentioned, she had resources, so she could kind of pick her way through a minefield. And she had some options that were open to her, and she had a great deal to consider. She could have gone home, and there would have been shame and embarrassment and possible rejection. She could have stuck me in a backpack and gone back out ice skating with me, and I've heard a couple of stories quite like that. And she also had the option to terminate the pregnancy, and I know that was the case because there's some interesting connections with the hospital where she ultimately gave birth to me, and she chose not to do that. She made that decision to seek out a good adoption situation for me.
Yeah, and it sounds like she found a great home for you.
She did. She came up with a list of what she wanted for me, which was not the way those things went. And in that era, it was kind of give up the baby, move on, and we'll take care of the rest. And she had a list of things. She wanted me baptized. She wanted parents who owned a home. She wanted a stay-at-home mom. And some of that I knew because people who had been involved told me that. Other things I was able to deduce. She wanted the home for me. My parents built a home out on suburban Long Island in New York, and across from my grandparents, and my father just hated going out there, but he built a house there. And as soon as my adoption was finalized, and in New York at that point, it took 18 months before an adoption was finalized. That house was on the market and sold, and he had moved back to New York City. Wow. So there we did some deducing there, but she knew precisely what she wanted. And if I had a regret in not meeting her, it was just to tell her, I appreciated what she went through in thinking it through, and that it worked out better than she could have ever imagined.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes me wonder. You mentioned that, you were living around the corner from her, within walking distance.
Yeah, relatively close. Yeah.
Relatively. I wonder if she ever ran into you or saw, your adoptive parents with you.
It's an interesting thought, and I don't know. Yeah. It certainly is not impossible. She traveled a lot. Once I was placed for adoption, she went back to performing, within months, and she was traveling the Caribbean and South America and ultimately Europe. So she, it's not like she was in the neighborhood all the time, but it's certainly not impossible.
How'd you come up with the title, The Gift Best Gift?
There's a discussion in the book between my birth mother and a woman who's a staff member at the hospital. And my mother is kind of pondering, or the staff member says something to her when she finds out and confirms that she's pregnant, that you've been given a gift. And, my birth mother said, well, I don't know. She said, I'm not sure how to manage this gift. She goes through her, her concerns, and, later in the conversation, the staff member says something along the lines of, sometimes the best gift is the one that you give and not the one that you're given. And, implying that sometimes something's put in your hands and you might want to re-gift that.
Yeah, and re-gifted she did.
Yeah, and that I pulled the title from that conversation.
Yeah, it's a beautiful title. That's a beautiful story that you just shared about that conversation with between your mother and that, it sounds like, the nurse from the hospital. I'm curious. I know we've been talking a lot about sort of your birth mother's background. We don't know too much about yours, though. So just pausing on the meat of your book, tell me a little bit about you and sort of where you grew up and what did you do for a living and all that good stuff.
I was an early underachieving ne'er-do-well. No, I was a good kid. My parents brought me up right, but I grew up in Queens in New York City. It's one of the five boroughs. And again, my birth mother was not very far away. Um, Out of school, what did I do? I had a succession of various things that I did, but among them is I was New York City's largest Appaloosa horse breeder. And yeah,
Okay.
I had a fondness for horses and did that. I ran an employment agency in New York City, a temporary agency at a time when temporary staffing was a new concept in the business place, and we did variable staffing for the major financial institutions in the city. I eventually went to work for an airline, and I went there just as let me fill in some extra hours as a part-time temporary employee as a reservations agent. I eventually wound up running the reservation center and then transferred from New York City to Houston, Texas, and ran a major reservation center down there for Continental Airlines, which has now been swallowed up by United Airlines.
Sure, sure.
From there, moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I worked with Dish Network in the customer service end of the business and had a big call center up there with 1,200 people in it. So it was a small city. We could have published our own newspaper with between births and deaths and everything else that was going on there, and then moved from Pittsburgh down here to Hillsborough, North Carolina. And again, I worked on the customer service side for Duke University Health Systems, and then retired in the early teens. And since then have been pursuing a number of interests. I was a triathlete until too many things started hurting. And the people who are successful with that either start very young and their bodies do hold up, or wait till they're older and haven't abused their bodies. I kind of strode the middle ground there. So I've got a bad toe and a bad ankle and a bad wrist, and so now I go out for long walks and drink coffee at the coffee shop. And and most of my time, leisure time, is occupied either with family, with my wife, or working on this book and its marketing and publicity, as well as starting to write a sequel to the book.
Wow. Well, I'm always curious to get to know my guests a little bit more. One way I do that is through pop culture. So I'm curious, Ed, when you were growing up, what were some of your favorite TV shows?
I heard you ask somebody that question. I could take you one better. I remember a couple of favorite radio shows.
Oh, give me a radio program.
Yeah, I remember Lee Marvin, and I think it was M for Murder, something like that. But it was at the very end of that era where there were, radio dramas that would go on for 20 minutes or so. But as a kid, I loved Lone Ranger. I loved Sky King, loved the Cisco Kid. And and still, if I see a repeat on, I'll go back looking for them.
Yeah. What about now? Do you anything that catches your eye now in terms of TV?
Still love Seinfeld. I come from New York City, and
I'm right there with you.
And I've watched the same episodes over and over and over, and then still laugh.
I have three 20-year-olds at home. So my wife and I have triplets, and
Wow.
They're all in college now. They were home for the holiday break, and two out of the three have become Seinfeld fanatics. And my son, I think, he's on the last season. He's been watching it in order, and I just love the fact that when I come home, or they'll be watching Seinfeld, and I'll just sit on the couch. And the one I was watching recently was the one where George thought he had John Voight's car, his Chrysler in there. And it was the Thanksgiving episode. Oh God, it was so funny. And my wife can't stand Seinfeld. She can't stand it. So one of the things she said, she's like, Mike, the kids went back on Monday. She's like, I miss the kids. I don't miss hearing Seinfeld all day. I'm like, well, we disagree on that.
The great part is, if you're an aficionado, you could sit down in the middle of any episode and know precisely where you are.
Yeah. Oh, it's so good. It's one of the funniest shows ever made. So there, we can agree on Seinfeld. What about books? Any favorite books you have? Favorite authors?
Actually, something that triggered this entire process, and it was I had it with me when I was standing over that grave in New Jersey, is I was reading, probably for the third time, a book called The Lost, A Search for Six of 6 Million. And it was written by a college professor and a classicist by the name of Daniel Mendelsohn. And it was a very personal story for him. He went on a journey to determine the specific fate of 6 family members who had perished in the Holocaust. And he traveled all over the world to find people who had known them and who could possibly fill in those blanks. And that was a big inspiration for me. I was thinking, if he could do that for his 6 people, I could do it for my birth mother. So that was a big piece. I've now gone back to reading a lot of the 1960s and 70s writers. I'm deep into Philip Roth and read a lot of his material. I've been enjoying John Updike an awful lot. And, and I've been keeping in touch with a couple of local book clubs as well. So some of the more modern fiction as well.
That's great. That's great.
So I read an awful lot.
Yeah. Well, it's a good thing. It's better than TV. I don't know why I always ask people about TV shows. I mean, it's a podcast for authors, and I'm always asking about TV, but I always find some common ground with them somehow, like I did with you and Seinfeld.
Somehow I've always got time for TV. When I can't find Seinfeld, I'm watching The Big Bang Theory.
What about big lessons you learned about yourself during the writing process, or any surprises, not about sort of what you were writing about, but surprises about writing a book? Because it sounds like it was the first time you ever tried anything like this.
Yeah, it was. I had done some journalistic writing before. As I said, I was involved with horses. I was an avid fly fisherman. So I wrote some articles for, various publications, but nothing of length. I guess the first thing that you learn is landing a publishing deal with the big 5 publisher is, that's a 1 in a million shot. And if you land it, and even if you land a deal with a smaller publisher, the time that's involved, not necessarily in the writing, but once you deliver your manuscript, what's involved from there. And I went through the process of querying in excess of 80 agents.
Yeah.
The majority of whom really had no interest, and they displayed that by never answering my queries. I got a handful of responses back, one with, "This sounds like an interesting project. Please send me the complete manuscript." And then she disappeared on me.
Wow. That's a decent sign anyway.
Yeah.
Just getting a form letter rejection. But.
Yeah. And then there was interest with a couple of the smaller presses as well as hybrid publishers. And when I sat down and I thought through the time that was involved and the economics that were involved, I said, I could do this myself. Because even with the smaller publishers, a great deal of the marketing and putting the public face on the book falls to the author. There aren't resources with the publishers any longer we're going to send you out on tour and we're going to do a lot of advanced publicity for you. And I said, I can do my own publicity. I said, I can put together the pieces of publishing a quality book. And that's what I chose to go ahead and do.
And if you had to give advice to anybody looking to do the same thing, to write a memoir, what kind of advice would you share with that person?
Well, I think a lot of people tend to think that this is my story, who's going to care? And I think people do care. So I would say sit down, start writing. I said, if, you'll have it for yourself. If, you've got 3 20-year-olds, I'm not sure if you wrote your memoir, any of them would care. But, they'll eventually have kids. Somebody down that line is going to care. And I think obviously, do your research, tell your stories, and there's a lot of good education out there about how to write an interesting memoir. And I think that's an important piece. I mentioned Philip Roth. I just finished this morning reading what is considered a novel, but it's really a novella at best, called Patrimony. And it traces his essentially holding his elderly's father's hand through the last months of his life. And it's just brilliant, but it's not, we started here and we ended up here. There are so many divergences and other stories told in the midst of it. So you can, examine your life carefully. You've got a lot to tell. You've got a lot of experiences.
Well, now that we've given advice to people we don't know, how about giving advice to someone you do know? So if you could go back in time and whisper some words of advice into the younger Ed Di Gangi's ear, what would you tell your younger self?
I was a classic underachiever in school. And I look back now and say, boy, I wish I paid better attention. I wish I did my homework. So I think, it's like suck it up and do your work and you'll be a better person for it. I think I'm a good person, but I think I would have been light years ahead in terms of what I'm gathering up now in terms of knowledge.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure there's some people listening to our conversation, and they're wondering, hey, where can I buy The Gift Best Given? So where can they buy it?
Well, the book is widely available. It's, everybody goes to bookstore.org or to Amazon if you want to purchase it online. It's available from your local bookstore. If they don't have it on the shelf, they can order it for you. And it's available. I'd be happy to send out a signed and personalized copy from my website, which is at www.digangieauthor.com. And, we accept credit cards, and if the order comes in today, it goes out today. It's also available in many libraries. It's available on Hoopla. It's available on Overdrive. So if you don't care to invest in purchasing the book, it's typically available for download as an ebook from one of the libraries. And it's, again, on Amazon, available on Kindle. It's available on all of your electronic forms.
Well, we'll be sure to put that note about getting a signed copy from your website in our show notes. And Ed, if people want to get in touch with you, how can they do so?
Feel free to use the website, or you can email me directly at edward.digangi.author@gmail.com. And I'm available on Facebook at Di Gangi Author and on Instagram at Di Gangi Author.
Very good. Ed, thank you so much for stopping by Uncorking a Story and letting me uncork yours.
Hey, Mike, thank you so much for inviting me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks for listening to Uncorking a Story. If you'd like more information about today's guest or to find out more about Mike, go to uncorkingastory.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review us at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in every week to hear Mike Carlin uncork a new story.